Daniel Carter had not been on a date for 5 years. Not because he was no longer capable of loving someone, but because he was no longer sure he was brave enough to lose one more time. That night, winter winds swept through a small Midwestern town in the United States, carrying delicate snowflakes that tapped against the diner's windows like cold whispers. Daniel sat alone at a corner table in the old diner familiar to the locals, a place where the scent of hot coffee, melting butter, and cinnamon blended in the air, creating a false sense of warmth that he no longer felt he belonged to. He glanced down at the watch on his wrist. 7:15. He had arrived 10 minutes early, a hard habit to break for someone who had once lived by schedules, by responsibility, by consistently showing up on time, even on the most painful days. Daniel expected nothing from this date. Just a dinner, a polite conversation, a simple, nice to meet you, and then each went home. Nothing more. He had told himself that the entire drive here, as if repeating it enough times, would convince his heart to believe it. The chair across from him remained empty. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into his skin, trying to chase away the cold that crept deep into his bones. Outside, the snowfall grew heavier. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, forming blurred patches of yellow light, an image that suddenly tightened his chest. Because 5 years ago, on a winter night just like this, those lights had reflected on the snow as well, but in flashing red and blue from police cars. That night had taken his wife from him. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and opened them again. He did not want to think about it, not tonight. Not when he had promised himself and his daughter that he would try. Emma. Her image appeared so vividly that the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. That morning, as Daniel put on his coat to leave the house, Emma had run over and wrapped her small arms tightly around his neck, the scent of milk and children's soap still lingering in her hair. "Dad," she whispered, her voice serious in a way no 9-year-old should be. "Mom would want you to be happy." Daniel had frozen. No child should ever have to say those words. No child should ever carry the worry that her father has forgotten how to smile. And yet Emma had said them. That was why Daniel was sitting here. He adjusted the dark blue sweater, the one Emma had chosen for him, saying it made his eyes look less sad. An innocent remark that struck straight into the deepest part of his heart. The diner door opened. A rush of cold air swept in, drawing a few curious glances. Daniel looked up instinctively. A woman stepped inside. She wore a dark coat, her hair neatly tied back, her expression calm. She scanned the diner, her eyes moving quickly across the tables, then pausing for a brief moment, just not on him. Daniel lowered his gaze. He smiled at himself. Of course, this date did not mean anything. He was only waiting subconsciously, like an old habit from the days when he used to expect someone to come home every night. Another woman approached his table. She looked to be in her early 30s, with a gentle smile and warm eyes that made people feel seen, not judged. "Would you like anything else?" she asked. Daniel shook his head, then hesitated. Could I have another coffee?" "Of course," she replied softly. She turned away, but before leaving the table her gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, as if she noticed something in his closed-off posture, in the slight weight resting on his shoulders. When she returned with the fresh cup of coffee, Daniel thanked her, and somehow, without knowing why, he began to talk. At first it was just small talk, the weather, the diner, trivial things. But then, in a strangely natural way, the conversation began to flow, gentle and effortless, as if the dam he had built around his heart for 5 years had suddenly developed a small crack. He talked about his home repair work, about living in a town where everyone knew everyone, about his daughter. His voice softened when he mentioned Emma. The woman listened, truly listened. She did not interrupt. She did not pity him. She did not rush to offer hollow words of comfort. And in that moment, Daniel forgot why he had come. He forgot the empty chair across from him, forgot that he had planned to sit for a while and then leave. Until her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Her expression shifted, brief confusion, brief hesitation. Then she stood up. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice still gentle. "I need to take care of something urgent." And before Daniel could say anything, she turned and walked toward the back of the diner, the door marked staff only, closing behind her. Daniel sat there, alone. The coffee cooled in his hands. A familiar feeling washed over him, the feeling of someone who had momentarily forgotten that he was no longer anyone's choice. He pushed his chair back and reached for his coat. Maybe he had been wrong to come here. Maybe hope, no matter how small, was always the most dangerous thing of all. And just then, when Daniel was about to leave, the diner door burst open so hard that the bell above it rang violently. A woman stumbled inside through the falling snow. Her eyes found him instantly, and she spoke 5 words that would change everything. The diner door burst open. A rush of cold air swept inside, carrying snow and the hurried breath of someone who had been racing against time. Daniel turned his head instinctively, and he saw her. The woman stood in the doorway. Her dark coat was covered in snow, her hair clung damply to her cheeks, and her lips were pale from the cold. She was trembling. Whether from the temperature or from exhaustion, it was hard to tell, but her eyes were strikingly bright. Those eyes found Daniel immediately. She hurried toward him, each step heavy, as if her legs were close to giving out. When she stopped in front of the table, she took a deep breath and then spoke 5 words, 5 short words, yet enough to turn that entire winter night upside down. "I'm sorry. I'm late. I'm your date." Daniel froze. Every thought in his mind was suddenly buried under snow. This woman, the soaked, exhausted woman standing before him, was the one he had been waiting for. Not the woman who had just left. Not the conversation that had seemed so meaningful, but her. Daniel opened his mouth, but it took him a few seconds to find his voice again. "It's okay," he said, realizing he truly meant it. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she clearly wasn't. She apologized repeatedly about her car breaking down on the highway, about the snowstorm paralyzing traffic, about her phone battery dying before she could let him know. "I tried to come back," she said, her breathing still uneven. "I didn't want you to think I wasn't coming." That sentence, unadorned and straightforward, touched something deep inside Daniel in a way he hadn't expected. For 5 years, he had grown used to people leaving, used to incomplete promises, used to not take an extra step for him anymore. And yet this woman had crossed a long distance through a snowstorm. Daniel pulled out a chair for her and helped her sit down. He ordered hot water, then coffee. The staff brought over a towel and a steaming mug of cocoa. She wrapped both hands around the cup as if clinging to the last bit of warmth left. "My name is Rachel," she said, offering a tired but sincere smile. "Daniel," he replied. "Nice to meet you." The words sounded ordinary, but inside him a strange feeling rose, as if everything before this moment had merely been a prelude. They began to talk. At first, there was some awkwardness, like any first date, but it quickly faded. Rachel asked about his work, about the small town where he lived. Daniel talked about repairing houses, about old homes that needed fixing, and somehow he found himself talking more than usual. Rachel listened, truly listened. She didn't check the time, she didn't interrupt, she didn't seem impatient. When Daniel asked about her, Rachel spoke simply about her life, about her dull but stable accounting job, about her younger brother, Noah, and how she had become his guardian after their mother passed away. Her voice softened when she mentioned family, but she never sought pity. Daniel realized something that surprised him. he felt at ease. At ease, being around someone who understood what it meant to live for someone else. At ease, not having to explain why pain doesn't fade with time. 20 minutes passed so quickly that Daniel didn't notice. He talked about Emma, his daughter, about how she had changed his life. His voice grew quieter, gentler. Rachel smiled as she listened, a smile filled with understanding. "I get it," she said softly. "Living for someone else? Sometimes it's the only way to keep going." Then Rachel's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. In just a moment, her expression changed, not annoyed, but confused. She excused herself, stood up, and walked quickly toward the back of the diner. Daniel watched her go. A familiar feeling began to surface. Doubt. Self-blame. The thought that maybe he had misread everything. Maybe the conversation had been nothing more than politeness. He was reaching for his coat when a young waitress approached. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "are you waiting for Ms. Reed?" Daniel stiffened. The waitress explained that Rachel Reed had called the diner nearly half an hour earlier, saying she had car trouble on the highway due to the snowstorm, and had asked the staff to inform her date that she would be late. Daniel felt the blood rush to his face. Every piece fell instantly into place, and his heart seemed to drop straight into his chest. The woman he had been talking to for 20 minutes was not Rachel. He had sat at the wrong table. He had talked about his late wife, about his daughter, about his most private pain with a stranger. Daniel turned to look toward the back door of the diner. She had realized the mistake, and she had left without saying a word. "Would you like to wait for Ms. Reed?" the waitress asked. "It might take a while longer. The roads are really bad." Daniel looked out the window. The snow was falling heavily. The wind was so strong that snowflakes flew sideways, turning the street into a white blur. He thought of Emma, at home, probably already in her pajamas waiting for him. He thought of the feeling he had just had, the feeling of being understood, of being heard. And he realized how exhausted he was from carrying his sadness alone. "Yes," Daniel said after a breath. "I'll wait." He stayed seated, alone, in a Christmas-decorated diner. Warm yellow lights reflect against the cold glass. Outside, the storm continued, and Daniel had no idea that this waiting would become the most significant test his heart had ever faced. Daniel sat alone in the diner, staring at the empty chair across from him. Just minutes earlier, he had been ready to stand up, put on his coat, and leave. Not out of anger, but out of embarrassment. The feeling of someone who had accidentally poured out his most profound truths to a stranger, only to realize he had misunderstood everything. He ran his hand lightly along the worn edge of the wooden table. The surface was cold and rough, exactly like the sensation in his chest at that moment. The diner was still warm. Christmas music played softly. Small strings of lights hung along the window frames, casting a gentle golden glow, so entirely at odds with the storm howling outside. Daniel had never thought that staying could be this hard. Staying meant accepting the emptiness. Staying meant not running from expectation. Staying meant giving something, however fragile, one more chance. He took a deep breath and lifted his cup of water, then set it back down when he noticed his hand trembling slightly. 45 minutes passed. Outside the window, snow swirled in thick spirals as if the entire world were being obscured. Daniel rechecked his watch. He thought of Emma. She was probably rewatching her favorite Christmas movie, curled up in her blanket, yawning as she fought sleep. At least Emma was safe. At least she was smiling. That thought kept him there. Then the diner door flew open. Not like before, not gently, not hesitantly. The door burst open with such force that the bell hanging from the frame rang violently. A blast of cold air rushed inside, carrying snow and biting chill straight toward the tables near the entrance. Daniel looked up. A woman staggered in. Her head was lowered, one hand gripping her coat, the other pushing the door shut. Snow covered her shoulders and hair. Her dark coat was soaked through. She paused for a second, as if trying to catch her breath, then lifted her head. Their eyes met. Daniel recognized her instantly. Rachel. She saw him and walked toward him, her steps heavy but determined. When she reached the table, she stopped, her shoulders rising and falling as she struggled to breathe. I'm sorry, she said, her voice unsteady from the cold. I'm really late. Daniel jumped to his feet. Every thought in his mind vanished, replaced by something else, lighter, warmer, and unexpectedly real. It's okay, he said, resting his hand on the chair. I'm really glad you came. Rachel sat down and let out a long breath, as if only now allowing herself to stop. She apologized again and told the story of her car breaking down in the middle of the road, of the snow-covered stretch she had to walk because she couldn't get a ride. I thought maybe you would have left, she said, a hint of worry in her eyes. Daniel shook his head very slightly. I almost did, he admitted. But then I thought, if you were trying that hard to get here, I should wait. Rachel looked at him, silent for a few seconds. Then she smiled, a smile that wasn't perfect, wasn't radiant, but was real. A server brought over a thick blanket and a mug of hot cocoa. As Rachel wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, Daniel noticed that her hands were still shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from exhaustion. Thank you, she said softly. They began talking again, this time more slowly, more deeply. There were no more polite questions, no more initial caution. Rachel asked about Emma. Daniel told her, and this time he didn't avoid anything. He talked about that morning, about his daughter's arms around his neck, about the words that had pushed him to come on this date. His voice grew heavier when he spoke of his wife, of the winters that had felt endlessly long since the day she passed away. Rachel listened, the same way she always did, without judgment, without interruption. When it was her turn, Rachel talked about Noah, about becoming a guardian when she was far too young, about working late nights just to make enough to pay the bills, about the feeling of always having to be strong, because if she fell apart, there would be no one left to hold her brother up. Daniel looked at her and recognized something familiar in her eyes, the look of people who have no choice but to keep going. Time passed without them noticing. The staff began clearing tables. The diner grew quieter. Outside, the snow fell more gently. When they stood up to leave, Rachel paused by the door and turned to Daniel. Thank you, she said, for waiting. Daniel looked at her, then nodded. I'm really glad I didn't leave. They stepped outside, the cold wrapping around them immediately, but it was no longer so harsh. The snow had stopped. The street lay beneath a peaceful white cover. Daniel opened the car door for Rachel. Before getting in, she paused and looked back at him. I think we should see each other again, she said hesitantly. If you want to. Daniel smiled. This time the smile wasn't forced. I do. And in that moment, in the quiet winter night, Daniel realized something he had forgotten for many years. Sometimes, what changes our lives, it is not a grand moment, but a tiny decision to stay when we could have walked away. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual, not because of his alarm clock, but because of a strange feeling, the kind that wakes you before the sunlight does. He lay still for a few seconds, staring at the familiar ceiling, listening to the faint sound of wind slipping through the window frame. The snow had stopped falling. The small town was wrapped in the rare stillness of a winter morning. Daniel suddenly realized that it had been a long time since he had woken up without carrying a heavy feeling in his chest. His phone vibrated. A short message appeared on the screen. "I got home safely. Thank you for last night. Rachel." Daniel stared at the words longer than necessary. He typed a reply, deleted it, then typed again. In the end, he sent just a simple sentence. "I'm really glad you came." That was all. And yet his heart skipped a beat. In the kitchen, Emma sat on her high stool, her legs swinging, eating cereal while watching the snow melt outside the window. She looked up when she saw Daniel, her eyes lighting up in the way only children can. "Did you have fun on your date?" Emma asked, so straightforward that Daniel laughed. He poured himself some coffee and leaned against the counter. "Yes," he answered after a brief pause. "More fun than I expected." Emma nodded, as if that were obvious. "Mom would like that," she said, then went back to her cereal as if the words carried no weight at all. But Daniel felt it, clearly. That afternoon, Daniel texted Rachel and asked a question he had never imagined himself asking anyone over the past 5 years. "If you're free this weekend, would you and Noah like to stop by my workshop? Emma's insisting on making Christmas decorations." He sent it before he could change his mind. The reply came almost immediately. "Yes, Noah would love that, thank you." On Saturday afternoon, Rachel arrived at Daniel's house with Noah. The teenage boy was tall and thin, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his eyes guarded in the way of children who have learned too early how to protect themselves. Rachel stood beside him, her smile gentle but slightly tense, as if she were stepping into a space she wasn't sure she belonged in. Emma opened the door before Daniel could even come out. "Hi!" she exclaimed, then grabbed Noah's hand without hesitation and pulled him along. "I'll show you where to make the best star." Noah paused for a moment and looked at Rachel. She nodded, offering an encouraging smile. He let himself be pulled away, and Daniel caught a glimpse of a tiny smile forming at the corner of the boy's mouth. The wood shop behind the house quickly filled with noise, the soft buzz of a saw, the rasp of sandpaper against wood, Emma's non-stop chatter. Daniel showed Noah how to cut basic shapes. The teenager listened intently, asking precise, quick questions that surprised Daniel. Rachel sat beside Emma, patiently helping her smooth the edges of the wood, praising every small detail. Emma beamed under that attention, as if she had found a special audience for her world. Daniel stood still for a moment, watching the scene before him. It looked like a family. The thought tightened his chest, not with sadness, but with fear. Fear that if he allowed himself to believe in this, he might lose it again. As dusk settled, Emma ran over and hugged Rachel without asking first. "You smell like cinnamon," she said, her voice full of trust. "You'll come back, right?" Rachel froze for a moment, then hugged Emma back. "I promise," she said, and Daniel knew it wasn't an empty promise. On the drive to take them home, the car moved slowly through snow-covered streets. No one spoke much, but the silence no longer felt heavy. Before getting out, Rachel turned to Daniel. "Thank you," she said, "for giving Noah and me such a normal afternoon." Daniel understood what she meant. For people who have lost so much, normal is a rare gift. As the car disappeared down the street, Daniel stood in the cold, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know where this connection would lead, but for the first time in many years, he no longer wanted to run from that question. Because sometimes, happiness doesn't arrive with a loud sound. It arrives quietly, through an afternoon of woodworking, an unguarded handhold, and the feeling that two worlds once broken are beginning to touch, very slowly, very real. The days that followed passed slowly. In a way, Daniel had almost forgotten life could still feel. There were no major upheavals, no grand promises, just small things, repeated, and, because of that, becoming precious. Rachel began appearing more often in the house. Sometimes it was just a brief stop to return a scarf Emma had left in the car. Other times it was a simple outing, hot coffee on a foggy morning, or an afternoon walk around the neighborhood while the snow had yet to melt entirely. Daniel realized he had started to look forward to those moments. Not in the impulsive way of someone newly infatuated, but in the careful way of someone who had once lost everything. He didn't name the feeling. He simply let it exist, quietly, just enough. Emma, on the other hand, hid nothing. She talked about Rachel as if she were already a natural part of her world. She told stories about the little things Rachel had shared with her, about the way she listened to how Noah had taught her to draw snowflakes so they were perfectly symmetrical. Daniel observed everything from the background. He watched Noah slowly become less withdrawn. The teenager no longer crossed his arms over his chest every time he stepped into Daniel's house. The constant guarded look in his eyes faded. In its place came questions about wood, about tools, about how to build something from nothing. Daniel understood that feeling, the need to prove one's worth, the desire not to become a burden. One evening, Rachel invited Daniel and Emma to her small apartment to bake gingerbread cookies. The apartment was in an old building on the edge of town. The furniture didn't match, but everything was neat and tidy. Hand-cut paper snowflakes decorated the walls. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with old, handmade ornaments. "My place is a bit small," Rachel said, a little self-conscious. Daniel shook his head. "It's very warm," he said. And he realized he wasn't exaggerating. The kitchen quickly grew crowded. Emma excitedly cracked eggs, flour dusting the countertop. Noah quietly helped her clean up, so patient that Rachel looked at her brother with visible surprise. Daniel stood beside Rachel, rolling out dough together. Their shoulders brushed lightly. Neither of them stepped away. The moment was small, but it made Daniel feel his heart skip a beat. When the cookies went into the oven, the kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and brown sugar. Emma laughed out loud. Noah smiled softly. Daniel looked at them, and for the first time in many years, he allowed himself to think about the future. No sooner had the thought appeared than fear followed. Rachel asked about Claire, his wife, in a gentle voice. Not curious, not pressing. Daniel told her about that winter night, about working late, about the guilt that still clung to him every time snow fell. Rachel said nothing until he finished. Then she told him about her mother, about the long illness, about having to grow up too early to protect Noah, about college dreams put on hold indefinitely. They stood there, hands dusted with flour, sharing pain that didn't need to be named. But after dinner, when Emma had fallen asleep on the sofa, Noah pulled Rachel aside. Daniel pretended not to listen, but every word still reached him. Noah said he could see what was happening. Rachel had started smiling more, so he didn't want to be the reason she gave up anything anymore. Rachel didn't respond right away, but Daniel saw her shoulders tremble slightly. That night, as Daniel drove them home, Rachel was silent the entire way. At her door, she turned to him. "I'm sorry if everything is moving too fast." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not afraid of fast," he said honestly. "I'm afraid of losing." Rachel looked at him for a long moment. "So am I." In the days that followed, Daniel felt the change clearly. Happiness was no longer an abstract idea, it was present in every detail, in the kitchen, in the workshop, in the laughter of Emma and Noah. And because of that, the fear grew stronger. Because Daniel knew that when something becomes essential, it also becomes fragile. One morning, while Daniel was fixing the fence in front of the house, Rachel called. Her voice was different. "Daniel," she said, "I need to talk to you." He stopped what he was doing, sensing something was wrong. "I received a job offer," Rachel continued, "a very good position, in another state." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. A cold wind blew past, carrying the sound of metal clanking against metal from the fence he hadn't finished securing. He knew this moment would come. He just hadn't expected it to come so soon. And in his chest, the happiness that had only just begun to bloom started to tremble at the first wind of separation. After Rachel finished that sentence, she fell silent. On the other end of the line, Daniel did not respond right away. He stood still in the yard, his hand still holding the wooden plank he hadn't secured yet. The wind cut through the air, sharp and cold, but Daniel barely felt it. In his mind, only the last 4 words Rachel had said kept echoing. Another state. He had known this moment would come. He had just hoped it would come later. "Where?" Daniel finally asked, his voice so low and steady that even he was surprised. "Arizona," Rachel replied. "A large financial firm, a senior management position." Daniel nodded, even though he knew Rachel couldn't see him. He pictured the place, warm sunlight, open skies, a new beginning. He understood why they had chosen her. Rachel was capable. Always the one who carried the weight, always the one who never gave up. "The salary is very good," she continued, as if she needed to justify it. "Enough to cover Noah's college, enough to not struggle anymore." Daniel leaned back against the fence and closed his eyes. In his mind, images overlapped. Emma laughing in the woodshop. Rachel was standing in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. Noah quietly helps the little girl wipe flour off the floor. A family, only just beginning to form. "When do you have to give them an answer?" Daniel asked. "Next week," Rachel said softly. "They want me to start at the beginning of January." Next week. Not enough time to get used to it, not enough time to prepare, not enough time to let go without pain. That evening, Rachel came to Daniel's house, not for dinner, not for a long conversation. Just to be clear, to speak plainly, like 2 adults who knew that avoiding the truth would only make everything hurt more. Emma stayed in her room drawing pictures. Noah remained in the car, saying he needed to call a friend. Daniel and Rachel stood in the living room, surrounded by unfinished Christmas decorations. "I have to go," Rachel said. No question, no hesitation. Daniel looked at her. He saw those eyes, eyes long accustomed to sacrifice. But this time, fear was there too. "I know," he replied, and he truly did. He knew Rachel couldn't turn down an opportunity that could change her brother's entire life. He knew that love, if it began with holding someone back, would soon turn into regret. Emma appeared in the doorway holding a crayon drawing. "Look, Aunt Rachel," she said excitedly. "I drew the 4 of us." Daniel saw Rachel freeze. She bent down and took the drawing with both hands, as if it were something fragile. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Emma looked up. "Will you come back?" The question was innocent, but sharper than any words. Rachel didn't answer right away. Daniel knelt beside his daughter. "Adults can't always stay where they want to, sweetheart," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean I don't care." Emma nodded, but Daniel knew she didn't truly understand. And maybe she shouldn't, at least not yet. Rachel left shortly after. There were no tears, no arguments, only a heavy silence, the kind carried by people who had chosen what was right even though it still hurt. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat in the living room, the lights of the Christmas tree reflecting against the walls. The wooden ornaments Emma had made with Rachel and Noah hung quietly on the branches. Daniel touched the small star Emma had clumsily painted, and for the first time in many years, he felt that he hadn't just lost a person, but an entire future that might have been. On the day Rachel left, Daniel didn't go to see her off. He couldn't stand there watching her close the car door, knowing that if he said one more word, he would ask her to stay. And that was something he could not allow himself to do. Emma stood by the window for a long time. "Did Aunt Rachel leave, Dad?" she asked.
"Yes," Daniel replied. "She has to go work far away." Emma was quiet. Then she turned and wrapped her arms tightly around him. "I don't like it when adults have to do sad things," Emma said.
Daniel closed his eyes and held her.
"Neither do I."
The days that followed were heavy. Rachel called, texted, but distance began to take shape, not because they cared less, but because both were afraid to speak about things that could not be changed. Noah prepared his college applications. Emma grew quieter. Daniel worked more, as if keeping his hands busy would keep his heart from thinking. And then winter arrived more fiercely than ever. Weather reports warned of the biggest snowstorm in years. Schools closed early. Highways were restricted. Daniel looked at his phone and saw a familiar road listed among the warnings. The road where his wife had died. And also the road that Emma's bus would pass through. A sharp chill ran down Daniel's spine.
Hadn't yet understood what was coming. When the phone rang, and this time the fear was no longer imagined.
The storm arrived faster than predicted. By noon that day, snow was falling so heavily that Daniel could no longer see the house across the street. Wind howled through the bare trees, slamming waves of biting cold against the windows. On the television screen, the weather broadcast ran non-stop, lines of bright red warnings appearing again and again. Blizzard warning, roads closed, travel not advised. Daniel turned off the TV. He looked at the wall clock. It was past 3 in the afternoon. Usually by this time, Emma would already be home. She would hang her backpack on the hook by the door, run straight into the kitchen to tell him small stories from school, then ask what they were having for dinner. But today, the house was silent, frighteningly so. Daniel picked up his phone and called the school. "The bus is stuck," the woman on the other end said, trying to stay calm. "On the northern highway. The children are safe. We're waiting for rescue teams." The northern highway. Daniel felt the room tilt. He grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter and took a sharp breath to steady himself. That road, the snow-covered stretch cutting across low hills, was where, 5 years earlier, he had received the call that changed his life forever. The place where Claire never made it home. "How long will it take?" Daniel asked, his voice rough. "We can't be sure," the woman replied. "The weather is too severe." Daniel ended the call, hurriedly put on his coat and grabbed his car keys. He had to get there. He couldn't just sit still. The pickup truck skidded twice as soon as he pulled out of the driveway. Daniel drove slowly, hands clenched tight around the steering wheel. Snow blanketed the road, erasing every lane marking. When he reached the highway entrance, a police car blocked the way. "No one is allowed through," the officer said firmly. "The road is completely closed." "My daughter is on that bus," Daniel said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Please, just let me through." The officer looked at him, sympathy in his eyes, but still shook his head. "We're doing everything we can. You need to go back." Daniel sat there in the idling truck, snow piling up on the windshield. He couldn't move forward. He couldn't turn back. That feeling, trapped, powerless, was painfully familiar. His hand trembled as he picked up his phone. Daniel scrolled through his contacts. His finger stopped on one name: Rachel. He knew she had left, knew she was far away, knew texting her right now was pointless. But he typed anyway. "Emma is stuck on a bus, on the highway.
I can't get to her. I don't know what to do.
The message was sent before he had time to think. Daniel rested his forehead against the steering wheel and closed his eyes. He didn't pray for anything grand, just for a minor miracle, as if by not opening his eyes, the storm might disappear. 15 minutes passed. Then his phone vibrated. 3 words appeared on the screen.
I'm coming.
Daniel opened his eyes, confused. The phone rang immediately after. Rachel's voice came through, tight with urgency but steady.
I haven't gone far, she said quickly. Noah and I just reached Colorado Springs. Noah has a bad flu, so I stopped at a hotel.
Daniel opened his mouth to say something, to tell her not to come, to say the roads were dangerous, but Rachel cut him off.
Emma needs me, she said. That's enough.
The call ended. Daniel sat there, snow covering the windshield. For the first time in the storm, he cried. Silently. Just tears falling, hot and salty. He drove back home. Travis arrived not long after, unlocking the door with a spare key. He sat down beside Daniel without saying a word. 2 grown men, silent in the darkened room, listening only to the wind screaming outside. It was close to 6 in the evening when Daniel's phone rang.
We've brought the children to a warming station near the highway, the woman said.
You can come pick up your daughter. Daniel rushed to the car. The fire station was crowded, children wrapped in emergency blankets, hands holding cups of hot chocolate. Daniel searched through the crowd, his heart pounding. Then he saw Emma. She sat on a small chair, her face pale from the cold. Daniel ran to her, dropped to his knees, and pulled her tightly into his arms. Emma burst into tears.
Dad, you're hurting me,
she sobbed. Daniel didn't let go. You're okay now, he whispered. I'm here. Emma looked up, wiping her tears.
Aunt Rachel came, Dad, she said. She opened the bus door and stayed with us.
Daniel stood up and looked around. Where is she? A firefighter stepped over. She just left, he said. She refused to go to the hospital, said she had to get back to her sick brother. Daniel handed Emma over to Travis, then got back in the truck and drove south. The road was still covered in snow, the wind still strong, but inside his chest burned a fire he had never felt before. Rachel had faced the storm, had turned back, had saved his daughter, and he could not let her leave again without saying something. The road heading south was long and empty. Daniel drove through the layer of snow that had just stopped falling, his headlights cutting through the cold night. Everything around him seemed compressed into the heavy silence that follows a storm. But in his chest, his heart pounded, not from fear, but from something close to determination. He was far too familiar with being late to speak his feelings, late to hold on to what mattered, late to dare to believe that he deserved happiness. This time, he didn't want to be late again. The hotel where Rachel and Noah were staying was a small building by the highway. The neon sign out front flickered weakly, as if it too had just endured the storm. Daniel parked and hurried inside, the cold still clinging to his coat. After hearing Rachel's name, the receptionist gave him the room number, her eyes briefly widening in surprise, but she asked nothing more. Daniel stood outside the door for a few seconds and took a deep breath. Then he knocked. Noah opened the door. The teenager looked exhausted, his face pale from a fever that hadn't fully broken, but his eyes were clear. He recognized Daniel immediately, gave a slight nod, and stepped aside. She's inside, Noah said quietly. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her knees. She hadn't even had time to take off her coat. Her hair was disheveled, her face marked by exhaustion. When she looked up at Daniel, those eyes that had faced the storm and her deepest fears, trembled. Are you okay? Daniel asked, his voice rough. Rachel nodded, though her hands were still shaking. Daniel sat down beside her. He didn't say anything else. He simply took her ice-cold hands in his. "Thank you," he said at last. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Rachel shook her head as tears spilt over.
"I couldn't come," she said. "If something had happened, I would never have forgiven myself."
Noah cleared his throat softly behind them.
"There's something I need to say," he spoke up.
He opened his backpack, pulled out a crumpled envelope, and handed it to Rachel. She stared at it as if she already knew what it was, yet hesitated to take it. "That's the scholarship letter," Noah said, "from 2 weeks ago." Rachel froze.
"What did you say?"
she asked, her voice breaking. "I was awarded a full scholarship," Noah continued, lowering his head. "In-state university. Tuition, living expenses, everything." Rachel looked at the envelope in her hands, tears falling uncontrollably.
"Then why didn't you tell me?"
she asked, her voice trembling. Noah looked up, his eyes full of guilt. "Because I knew you wouldn't go to Arizona if you knew this," he said. "I didn't want you to give up your life because of me." The room fell silent. Rachel broke down, covering her face with her hands. Noah stepped closer, awkwardly placing a hand on his sister's shoulder. "I'm tired," he said quietly. "I don't want to be the reason you never get to be happy." Daniel watched the two of them, and for the first time, he clearly saw what had bound Rachel for so long, not responsibility, but guilt. When Noah went into the bathroom, Daniel spoke softly. "You have the right to choose happiness for yourself, Rachel." She looked up, her eyes red. "But I still need a stable job," she whispered. "I can't rely only on Noah's scholarship." Daniel nodded. "I know." He took a deep breath and said the words he had been thinking about the entire drive. "My company needs a financial manager," he said. "Not as a favor, a real position. Competitive salary, benefits, a future." Rachel stared at him, stunned. "Are you sure?" Daniel smiled, the calmest smile he had ever worn. "I've never been more certain of anything." She was silent for a long time. Then Rachel said softly, "I'm scared." Daniel tightened his grip on her hand. "So am I," he admitted. "But what I'm most afraid of is not trying." Rachel looked at him, tears streaming down her face, and then, very slowly, she nodded. No grand promises, no perfect plan, just one decision: to stay. The next morning they drove back to the small town. Snow covered every road, glistening under the pale winter sun. When Daniel opened the front door, Emma ran out and screamed upon seeing Rachel.
"You came back!"
she cried, throwing herself into Rachel's arms. Rachel held Emma tightly and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." Daniel stood behind them, watching, and realized, there are moments not meant for starting over, but for allowing yourself to continue. And this time, he knew they hadn't just survived the storm. They had chosen to live genuinely. 1 year later. The small town had entered winter again, but this winter was no longer like the ones before. Snow still fell, the wind was still cold, the roads were still covered in a quiet white, but inside Daniel's home, the lights were always turned on earlier, and laughter was heard more often. Daniel stood in front of the bedroom mirror, adjusting his collar. The motion was familiar, but the feeling was completely different. There was no longer the tension of someone afraid of making a mistake, no longer the anxiety of a man standing on the edge of happiness. Just an ordinary man, preparing for a significant evening. "Dad, are you ready yet?" Emma's voice called from the hallway, her excitement impossible to hide. "Almost," Daniel replied, smiling. He took one last look at himself in the mirror. 5 years earlier, he would never have believed he would be standing here. He would never have believed that after all the loss, a person could still build something new, not to replace what was gone, but to continue forward. The car stopped in front of the familiar old diner, where everything had begun. Inside, warm yellow lights reflected against fogged windows. The diner was simply decorated for Christmas Eve. A few pine reeds, a few strands of lights, and the familiar scent of cinnamon drifting through the air. Rachel was already there. She sat at the corner table wearing a dark blue sweater, the color suddenly reminding Daniel of that snowstorm night long ago. When she saw him, she stood up and smiled. Not rushed, not hesitant. A smile from someone who had chosen to stay. Emma and Noah sat at the nearby table, whispering to each other as they tried to contain their excitement. Noah had grown taller, calmer. Emma was the same as ever, her heart wide open to the world. Daniel pulled out a chair for Rachel and sat across from her. In that brief moment, all the surrounding noise seemed to fade away. "Do you remember the first night here?" Rachel asked softly. Daniel nodded. "I remember I almost left." Rachel smiled. "And I walked through a snowstorm." They looked at each other and laughed together, the laughter of people who had faced the worst side by side and who were no longer afraid to remember it. Dinner passed gently. There was no need for grand stories, no need for promises, just small details. Noah talking about college, Emma describing a new ornament on the Christmas tree, Rachel holding Daniel's hand beneath the table as a natural habit. When dessert was served, Daniel slipped his hand into his coat pocket. His heart beat faster, but it did not tremble. He stood up. Rachel looked at him, slightly surprised. "What's going on?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, then pulled out a small velvet box and placed it on the table. The diner suddenly grew unusually quiet. Daniel opened the box. The ring lay inside, simple yet elegant, not a symbol of display, but a promise from someone who had learned the value of staying. "I've thought about this for a long time," Daniel said, his voice low but steady, "about building a new life after loss. And I realized something." He looked at Rachel, never breaking eye contact. "Loving again doesn't mean forgetting the people who once mattered. It means honoring those memories by choosing to live fully." Rachel's eyes shimmered with tears. "I don't promise there won't be difficulties," Daniel continued. "But I promise I won't leave. Not when things get hard, not when fear returns." He knelt. "Rachel, will you marry me and build a family with me? Not a perfect one, but an honest one, with Emma, with Noah, and with everything the future brings?" Rachel didn't let him finish. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I will." Emma jumped up from her chair, clapping and cheering. Noah laughed, then turned away to wipe his eyes quickly. People around them began to applaud. Someone at the bar raised a glass in celebration. Daniel slipped the ring onto Rachel's finger, then helped her to her feet. They embraced, not hurriedly, but like two people who had waited long enough to cherish the moment, truly. Later that night, they returned home. Emma fell asleep just minutes after lying down. Daniel pulled the blanket over her and gently kissed her forehead. Then he and Rachel stood in front of the Christmas tree in the living room. The old wooden ornaments were still there. New ones had been added. An imperfect tree, but one full of stories. Rachel rested her head on Daniel's shoulder. "I'm very glad I didn't give up that day," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "So am I. I'm very glad I waited." Outside, snow fell softly. Inside, Christmas lights glowed warmly. Two people who had once been broken stood side by side, not because they had never been hurt, but because they had learned not to let pain decide the rest of their lives. And sometimes, the greatest gift of all, it isn't found beneath the Christmas tree. It is the chance to begin again, with someone who chooses to stay, even when everything once told them to walk away. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with a very gentle silence, the silence of people who finally exhale, no longer having to brace themselves against life. Daniel once believed that pain would stay with him forever, that after loss a person had only two choices, to become hardened or to close themselves off. He chose a third way, to keep living but without opening his heart. And for many years he believed that was enough, until he understood something no one had ever taught him. Surviving is not the same as living a whole life. Rachel once believed that sacrifice was a given, that loving meant giving herself up, that if she weren't strong, if she didn't carry the weight, her brother's world would collapse. But no one ever told her that someone who sacrifices for too long will eventually forget that they too deserve happiness. And Emma, a child who lost her mother far too early, was the one who understood most clearly what adults often avoid: that love is not what makes us weak, but what gives us the courage to go on. This story is not about a date, not only about a storm, and not exactly about a proposal. It is a story about people who were once broken, and the way they chose not to let those broken pieces define the rest of their lives. Daniel does not forget Claire. He does not need to. Rachel does not erase the years she spent sacrificing. She simply learns not to let them steal her future. They do not love each other to be saved. They love each other because, at last, they truly see one another, clearly, completely, without hiding. And that may be the most beautiful thing about mature love. Not, I will make you happy, but I will not walk away when things become difficult. Life does not promise a perfect ending. There will still be tiring days, old memories will sometimes return without warning, fears that seem asleep may still wait for their chance to rise again. But now, Daniel no longer faces them alone. Rachel no longer has to carry the entire world on her shoulders. And Emma knows that some people, even if they are not born into a family, still choose to create one. If you are watching this story and feel your heart grow heavy, perhaps it isn't because of what you've just heard, but because some part of you has once been like them. Perhaps you too have lost something, loved, and then been afraid to love again. Sacrificed so much that you forgot yourself, stood before happiness and turned away, believing you didn't deserve it. If so, remember this: a second chance does not come to erase the past. It proves that the past does not dictate the future. Some people will enter your life very late, but they do not come to replace what you lost. They come to help you build what is still possible. And sometimes, the thing that changes your entire life, it is not a grand decision. It is a tiny choice to stay when you could have easily walked away. Loving again is not a betrayal of the past. It is how we honor it by choosing to live. If this story made you pause for a few extra seconds, if you saw yourself somewhere in Daniel, in Rachel, or in Emma, then perhaps this story was told for you. Deep Life Tales believes that every person carries a story worth listening to, not because it is perfect, but because it is real. If you felt something from this video, please like it to help spread the story. Share it with someone who needs hope, and leave a comment. We would genuinely love to know what you thought and how you felt. And if you believe that stories about life, loss, and healing still matter, please subscribe to Deep Life Tales. We'll be here, telling stories slowly, deeply, and honestly enough so you don't feel alone. See you in the following story.